I watched from my living room window as two police cruisers pulled up to our house, their lights flashing in the afternoon sun. There on her porch stood Patricia Thornfield, the HOA president, arms crossed and a satisfied smirk plastered across her face. She had finally done it. She had called the cops on my wife. What Patricia didn't know was that in exactly 3 minutes those same officers would be saluting the woman she was trying to have removed from our own home. Let me back up a bit. My name is David Richardson, and this whole mess started when my wife Sarah and I moved into our dream home in Oakwood Heights 3 months ago. It was supposed to be perfect timing. Sarah had just returned from her third deployment overseas, and we were ready to settle into civilian life. Well, as civilian as life gets when your wife is a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. The neighborhood seemed ideal at first. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained lawns, and a community pool. What we didn't realize was that it came with its own self-appointed dictator in the form of Patricia Thornfield, a woman who wore her HOA president title like a crown and wielded her measuring tape like a scepter. Our first encounter with Patricia happened on moving day. Sarah was directing the movers in her civilian clothes when Patricia marched over with her clipboard. She said with a haughty tone that she was the HOA president and needed to review our moving permits. When I explained we didn't know we needed permits for our own driveway, she huffed and wrote something down. Strike one. Apparently the real trouble started when Patricia saw Sarah in her dress blues. One morning my wife was loading some gear into her car for a ceremony at the base when Patricia appeared like a bad penny. She asked in a suspicious voice what Sarah thought she was doing wearing that costume. When Sarah politely explained it was her military uniform, Patricia scoffed and said she doubted that, claiming no woman could achieve such a rank. From that day forward, Patricia made it her personal mission to find violations at our property. The grass was 1 foot long, our American flag was displayed at the wrong angle, our car was parked 2 in over our own driveway line. Each violation came with a formal notice and a smug visit from Patricia herself. Sarah handled it with military precision and patience, fixing each supposed violation within hours. But I could see it wearing on her. Here was a woman who had commanded squadrons and served her country with distinction, being harassed by someone whose greatest achievement was measuring hedge heights. The situation escalated when Patricia started questioning Sarah's military service openly. At HOA meetings she would say things like how suspicious it was that someone claiming to be military was home during the day, ignoring the fact that Sarah worked varied shifts at the base. Patricia even suggested that impersonating military personnel was a federal crime, clearly implying that Sarah was doing just that. I wanted to confront Patricia directly, but Sarah held me back. She said in her calm way that she had dealt with worse than suburban tyrants. She was documenting everything, keeping copies of every notice and recording the dates and times of Patricia's visits. My wife approached this like a military operation, and I should have known she had a plan. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon. Sarah had just returned from a planning meeting at the base and was unloading some classified document cases from her car. They were locked metal briefcases that she needed to secure in our home office. She was in her her working uniform when Patricia stormed across the street. Patricia shouted loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear that she knew Sarah was up to something illegal. She claimed those cases probably contained stolen goods and that the uniform was obviously fake. When Sarah tried to explain calmly that she couldn't discuss the contents due to security clearance, Patricia's eyes lit up like she had won the lottery. I watched from the doorway as Patricia pulled out her phone and dialed 911. She spoke in an urgent tone, claiming there was a dangerous intruder at our address, impersonating military personnel and carrying suspicious cases. She even added that the person was refusing to cooperate with the HOA president and might be armed. Sarah just stood there, shaking her head slightly. She carefully placed the briefcases on our porch and sat down on the steps to wait. When I started to go outside, she waved me back. She said quietly that Patricia had just made a very big mistake and it was better to let it play out. Within 10 minutes, 2 police cruisers arrived. Patricia practically ran to meet them, pointing at Sarah and talking rapidly. I could see her gesturing wildly. Clearly, painting Sarah as some sort of criminal mastermind. The two officers nodded, taking notes, then walked toward our house. That's when everything changed. The lead officer, a sergeant by his stripes, took one look at Sarah and stopped mid-stride. His partner, a younger officer, looked confused until the sergeant whispered something to him. Both officers straightened their postures noticeably. The sergeant approached Sarah with a completely different demeanor than when he had been talking to Patricia. He asked respectfully if she was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Richardson. When she confirmed, he actually smiled. It turned out the sergeant had been in one of Sarah's joint training exercises 2 years ago when she was stationed at the Regional Command Center. What happened next was beautiful to watch. The sergeant turned to his partner and explained that not only was Sarah exactly who she claimed to be, but she had personally developed some of the interagency cooperation protocols their department still used. The younger officer's eyes widened with recognition and respect. Then, in full view of Patricia and several neighbors who had gathered to watch the drama, both officers came to attention and saluted. My wife Sarah returned the salute crisply, then invited them to verify her credentials if they needed to for their report. The sergeant said that wouldn't be necessary, but asked if she wanted to file a complaint for false reporting and harassment. Patricia's face went through a rainbow of colors. She tried to interject, claiming she had made an honest mistake, but the sergeant cut her off. He explained sternly that calling 911 with false information, especially claiming someone might be armed when they weren't, was a serious offense. He also noted that harassment of military personnel could involve federal charges. Sarah, ever the professional, said she would think about pressing charges but definitely wanted a report filed. As the officers took her statement, Patricia tried to slink away, but the sergeant called her back. He needed her information for the false report charge. The younger officer, meanwhile, was asking Sarah about her service with genuine interest. When he learned she had been involved in planning operations that supported local law enforcement overseas, his respect visibly grew. He mentioned that his brother was serving in the Air Force and asked if Sarah might have some advice for him about advancing his career. More neighbors had gathered by this point, and everyone was getting quite an education about who Sarah really was. The sergeant made sure to speak loudly enough for all to hear when he apologized for the inconvenience and thanked her for her service to the country. He also made it clear that filing false reports about military personnel was something their department took very seriously. Patricia tried one more time to salvage the situation. She said in a shaky voice that as HOA president she had a duty to investigate suspicious activity. The sergeant replied that there was a difference between neighborhood watch and targeted harassment, especially when it involved false claims about federal officers. As the police prepared to leave, the sergeant handed Sarah his card and said she could call directly if there were any more issues. He then turned to Patricia and informed her that she would be receiving a summons for false reporting. The fine, he mentioned clearly, could be up to $5,000 plus potential civil liability if Sarah chose to pursue that route. The grand finale came when both officers stood at attention again and saluted Sarah before getting in their cruisers. As they drove away, Sarah finally stood up, picked up her briefcases, and headed inside. She paused at the door to look at Patricia, who was now surrounded by murmuring neighbors. The fallout was swift and decisive. Within 2 days, word had spread throughout Oakwood Heights about what had really happened. The story grew with each telling, and soon everyone knew that Patricia had tried to have a decorated military officer arrested from her own home based on nothing but prejudice and paranoia. The HOA board called an emergency meeting that weekend. I attended with Sarah, and the room was packed before the meeting even officially started. Board member after board member approached Sarah to apologize for Patricia's behavior and to thank her for her service. Several mentioned they had veterans in their families and were appalled by what had happened. When the meeting was called to order, the first item on the agenda was Patricia's conduct. The board's attorney, who had been hastily consulted, explained that Patricia's actions had exposed the HOA to significant legal liability, filing false police reports while acting in her capacity as HOA president could make the association liable for damages. Patricia tried to defend herself, claiming she was just doing her job, but The other board members weren't having it. They had reviewed the stack of violations she had issued to us, compared them to other homes in the neighborhood, and found clear evidence of targeted harassment. One board member pointed out that Patricia's own hedge was to an over regulation, yet she had never find herself. The vote to remove Patricia as president was unanimous, with Patricia abstaining. She sat there in shock as the board then voted to void all violations against our property and to issue a formal apology. The board's attorney recommended they also pay any legal fees we might incur if we decided to pursue action against Patricia personally. But the consequences didn't stop there. Patricia's employer, a real estate firm where she worked as an office manager, got wind of the incident, having an employee make headlines for harassing military personnel and filing false police reports. Wasn't good for business. By the following Tuesday, Patricia was job hunting. The criminal charges were the final blow. The district attorney's office, perhaps influenced by Sarah's service record and the egregious nature of the false report, decided to prosecute. Patricia ended up pleading no contest to a misdemeanor charge of filing a false report. The judge, a veteran himself, was not sympathetic. He sentenced Patricia to 100 hours of community service, specifically at the local VA hospital, 12 months of probation, and a fine of $3,000, plus court costs. When the sentence was read, Patricia's hands shook as she gripped the defendant's table, her face pale as the reality of her situation finally hit